Just why is the Chinese regime's persecution of faith groups in China of direct importance to Americans? And how is it part of the Chinese Communist Party's long-term plan to subvert America? Why was 2018 one of the worst years for religious persecution in China in decades? And how does the Chinese regime's powerful influence on Taiwan act as a warning to the rest of the world? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Today we sit down with Pastor Bob Fu, who escaped persecution in China 20 years ago to found China Aid, a Christian nonprofit promoting religious freedom for all. We discuss the reasons for his involvement in the newly formed Committee on the Present Danger, China, which seeks to educate about the existential threat the Chinese Communist Party poses to America and the rest of the free world. Pastor Bob Fu, great to speak with an old friend again.
Oh, thank you, Jan, for having me. Yeah.
So let's dive right into this newly formed Committee on the Present Danger, China, formed in the model of the previous Committee on Present Danger, which was, of course, focused many years ago on the Soviet Union and arguably played a very significant role. You're part of the organizing group of this new Committee on Present Danger, China. Can you tell me a little bit about how this was formed and what inspired you to dive right in?
Yeah, I mean, this committee, of course, was initiated by the two extreme outstanding leaders, on security and basically the American democratic values. Former President Reagan's advisor, Frank Gaffney, and Brian Kennedy. Of course, they all have been deeply concerned about the emerging threat from the communist regime. And me, of course, for really over a decade, we have been talking about this, the Chinese communist regime's threat, not only really to American interest, it's a threat to the global free society. It's really existential threat, now we can tell, to the civilized world. So when I'm approached by Brian and Frank and said, we need to really launch a public education campaign to raise awareness, to wake up the American kind of sleeping society for this real threat. I'm certainly very supportive, very glad to be included as one of the founding members. So the committee consists with members from the national security, cybersecurity, defense department, and intelligence community, and human rights defenders like me, and even with a component of religious freedom, because certainly we have seen one of the signature features of the Communist Party is they have been launching this war against the faith. And in essence, it is a war against civilization. So I'm really all for it, and I really want to see a moment happen in the United States and globally to really wake up. This not only a sleeping kind of a tiger is already a gigantic tiger, and that we may be too late to control if we don't take action right now.
So, you work a lot with various people who are persecuted for their faith, specifically Christians in China. But you yourself, many years ago, experienced that and made it out. Can you tell me a little more about how things have changed from the time when you experienced, persecution to today?
Yeah, I was an atheist in college, and almost joining the Communist Party, and then participated in the students' movement in Tiananmen Square 30 years ago. Then became an underground church leader, and my wife and I were both imprisoned, being accused of as an illegal evangelist in Beijing.
So after Tiananmen, somehow you became a person of faith from being an atheist.
Yes,
right? Yeah, okay.
That's right.
I understand.
Yeah. So then my wife and I were both thrown into prison. And at the time we thought, This is the first part of, in the Chinese house church, underground church, we call it prison theology time. Almost exclusively, every house church leader in the early generation had been imprisoned. The pastor who baptized me spent over 16 years in prison. The pastor in Beijing who married my wife and I, Pastor Alan Yuan, spent over 22 years in prison for his faith.
So they were persecuted purely for practicing their faith and inspiring others to practice it.
That's right. They were purely persecuted for practicing their faith peacefully and faithfully. Of course, against the Communist Party's religious policy. In that sense, they were imprisoned for 11 years, 10 years, and even now there are so many. Last year alone, we have recorded at least 5,000 arrests, and at least over 500 pastors and Christian leaders were formally imprisoned and sentenced.
What I'm trying to get at is, has the persecution of people of faith, be it Christians of others, has it
rise up?
Yeah, which direction has it gone since the time when you had to flee?
Certainly. 2018 is marked as the worst year of religious persecution in perhaps 40 years. We have not seen this kind of a level of persecution, both in quantity and in the degree of persecution since the end of the Cultural Revolution. For the first time, this is the religious persecution not only just limited to Protestant Christian community, but to Catholics, to Falun Gong practitioners, to, of course, the Uyghur Muslims and Kazakhs in Xinjiang, of course, that's another major disaster, right. And to Tibetans, of course. So to the people of faith, last year really is the worst year. We have never seen this kind of a degree of persecution. I mean, according to our own investigation, just for the Protestant Christians alone, we have seen thousands of churches were being banned, destroyed, and the crosses were forcibly demolished, and pastors were being jailed, and also at least 50,000 believers were physically and mentally tortured. We have seen, in the early Rain Covenant Church, a 500-member church in Chengdu, on December 9th, all of a sudden 300 members were arrested. And the pastor, who was a public intellectual, kind of a lawyer, Wang Yi, he was arrested, and his wife, both of them were already indicted as inciting the subversion of state power. So they are facing up to 15-year sentence for purely leading a house church. And it's across the board, a nationwide campaign. And for the first time, in the name of so-called Sinicization, right. 中国化, it's really 中国化 is like a communist 化. It's really the fast, kind of Nazification. That's the closest term I can find. 法西斯化, in 1930s, when Nazis, forced the church to hold Nazi symbols on their church. And today, in every government-sanctioned churches, and they are mandated to hold president or chairman or Emperor Xi's portrait and Chairman Mao's portrait, and the crosses outside were forcibly taken down.
So basically puts the party above the church. And
that's
the idea.
Right. And Xi Jinping wants actually to be a god, so that in that sense he wants to compete, and he doesn't like the fact that there is any other god that above him.
I see. Earlier this year, you and another group formed another committee, and this was the Committee to Advance Religious Freedom. Basically with the support of Ambassador Brownback and basically the
Religious Freedom Roundtable.
Yeah, yeah. So can you tell me a little more about the development of that?
Yes, with the the encouragement of Ambassador Sam Brownback, and of course over the years, the religious freedom champions in member of Congress from both sides of the aisle. Congressman Frank Wolf, who retired, and Chris Smith, and of course Jim McGovern from the Democrat side. They always have been encouraging the faith communities who are persecuted within the China context to be united in solidarity, because after all, the freedom of practicing our faith is the most fundamental freedom and value that we all cherished, despite our theological or doctrinal or faith the kind of belief differences. So based on that, I'm so glad. I mean, really, that's a miracle almost. Within the China community, we have this called Coalition to Advance Religious Freedom in China, launched on Capitol Hill, and the purpose is really to build a solidarity, united front. In that sense, a good united front, right, to deal with this evil regime and to expose what the persecution in China is, and to act in unity to tackle these specific issues, and also to advance those items like letters or legislations in Congress and in other capital cities of the world.
So the big question, I think, for a lot of Americans is, we can see there's a big problem in China at many levels, certainly on the human rights side, certainly on the persecution of religion side. But how does that impact Americans directly? Why is there this present danger and a need to focus on China? How is this connected, this persecution that you've been describing in China against faith groups?
In this global village, everything happens in another part of the world is interrelated, especially the world's two largest now economies, the United States and China.
Right.
And the theory 20 some years ago, when the so-called the PNTR, the permanent normal trade status, and the WTO were debated at Capitol Hill. The prevailing theory, and rather naively, I have thought that a long time ago, that more engagement, more trade, and more cooperation, and more appeasement with the communist regime will inevitably bring more freedom, middle class democracy.
Right.
But look,
didn't work out that way.
It worked in the opposite. The Communist Party proved to be more adaptive, more vicious, more aggressive, and really by using all the tools they have. Now I think really this big tiger is already growing too fat, growing too strong. In some sense, as the former Speaker Newt Gingrich said, in several areas, America is losing. The 5G technology, the military, even technology in the outer space, the South China Sea, many things. And I think, honestly, even the Communist Party's effort and in penetrating in the free society by sending, 100 Confucius Institute in American universities, who are almost like their Communist Party's branches, planted with full funding from the propaganda department, are doing their propaganda in American society, in European capitals. And they are stealing everything, from the seed in Iowa to the intellectual properties in the Silicon Valley. And they are using their financial power, purchasing, propagandas in the nation's capitals, and you name it.
Right, like in the Washington Post.
Yeah, every morning you have a China Daily, the Communist Party's top propaganda pages appear with the Washington Post. Is there any time that the People's Daily would have an insert of Washington Post? or New York Times or Wall Street Journal. Talk about the China threat, talk about the Communist Party's dictatorship, right? Talk about the persecution against its own citizens. No. Actually, I just noticed in the past few days, even 2 lawyers were censored by the Bureau of Justice for climbing the internet firewall on the Twitter and put a like, just a like. They just put the like button, they were censored of a message like they said, not friendly to our great leaders in the Communist Party.
So recently Xi Jinping was speaking with the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and in Beijing actually, and they were discussing, Xi I think was encouraging global governance, the sort of increase around the concept of global governance, and also encouraging that China would become kind of a keeper of the international order. I wondered if you could just tell me what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's both tells, the Communist Party's ambitious agenda not ended within the China's border, and also the kind of irony that the free and democratic world are facing. The danger is, the Communist Party is using this One Belt, One Road initiative, build a military base from Djibouti to Sri Lanka, using this debt diplomacy. Right. And they want to of course, take advantage of the UN system. All of a sudden, the world one of the most corrupted and tyrannical governments wants to be the protector of the world order for global governance. The Communist Party certainly would not rank in any, from transparency, freedom of press, any modern freedoms, as the best protector of anything on this front.
Well, certainly at the bottom of the list in most cases.
Yeah,
right?
most of the cases. Yeah. And of course, also the irony is now all of a sudden Xi Jinping was travel around the globe, proclaiming they want to be the protector when they are persecuting their own citizens in their own country. And how many Falun Gong practitioners were tortured to death? Thousands. And how many the Tibetans were self-immolated, several hundred. How many even the Church of God, Church of Almighty God, this a sect, were tortured to death. How many house church leaders, how many Catholic churches were being destroyed? As late as this week, we have seen, churches were being demolished against the will of the believers. And we have seen, many human rights defenders, at least 300, were lawyers, legal activists were being not only incarcerated, imprisoned, but tortured. And the most well-known, the human rights defender, the conscience of China, lawyer Gao Zhisheng, has been missing for over 1.5 years again after this most brutal
After all
torture.
sorts of persecution over decades, basically.
Yeah,
right.
And the other lawyer, Wang Quanzhang, who was just defending the religious freedom cases and has been imprisoned and secretly trialed and secretly sentenced, and nobody ever from any family member or legal representative of his family entrusted has ever seen him. For the past over 3 years already. Are these really a good sign of the leader of protecting world order? Or what kind of order if we allow Xi Jinping to be the head of the, this protector?
So Bob, what evidence do you see as being first and foremost in your mind that shows us that the Chinese regime is looking to expand all of these things that it's been doing within its own borders beyond? What's most stark in your mind?
Well, the evidence is everywhere almost. I mean, you have seen the Chinese regime using this the One Belt One Road initiative as a really a modern day. It's named by the current Malaysia Prime Minister as the neo-colonialism. It's the Communist Party's version of colonialism, a debt diplomacy named by Vice President Pence. You know, the kind of using the Asian so-called infrastructure bank to give them some loans to African countries or Southeast Asian countries, and now even penetrating into Italy in the heart of the European Union to build kind of bridges or ports, and essentially took over these really critical infrastructures. And they are, of course, also expanding their ideology through the Confucius Institute globally. How many, you know, hundreds of thousands, really, I mean, I think thousands already globally, right? In Europe, in the United States, you know, fully funded by the propaganda department of the Communist Party. And militarily, you can tell, I mean, what was happening in South China Sea. They are bullying Vietnam, Philippines, of course, Taiwan. And their aggressiveness also demonstrated in their cross-strait relationship in Taiwan, and they're penetrating deeply into the Taiwan society. I believe 90% of the Taiwan current media outlets were either owned or financially supported by the Chinese Communist Party propaganda money. And they're interfering this Taiwan election in massive ways. So economically, militarily, and culturally, ideologically, they are everywhere. And of course, their spying network is everywhere, from Boston to Iowa, right? You know, from stealing the plant seeds to the intellectual property of the high-tech field in the universities. So these are really so obvious a threat. And you know, honestly, as a church leader, I even sense clearly the Chinese Communist Party's influence in North American Chinese churches.
How does that manifest? That's very interesting.
Yes, yeah. It manifested in several ways. First, the Communist Party used its influence, a threat, most of the Chinese, overseas Chinese, because they want to go back to China with a visa if they join American citizenship even. If they don't have a citizenship, of course, they could face arrest anytime if they go back to China. So really...
And there's examples, multiple examples of that.
Multiple examples,
right.
China Aid. You know, we just want to educate the churches about the persecution of our own faith, you know, Christian brothers and sisters. And, you know, you should care about them. And this is in the scripture that you remember those who are in prison as if you were imprisoned with them. And how many Chinese churches in North America, among 1,500 churches, who really make a request to China Aid to ask for a newsletter, ask for some information? Almost zero. Over the past 15 years, maybe one or two, maximum 3 churches who receive, you know, our information. And we even take the initiative by sending our newsletters, our publications, like our annual persecution report, documenting this persecution. And you know what? Some churches even returned this information with a note, said, please, we are scared. Don't send this information to us anymore.
They're scared. What are they scared of?
They don't want to, you know, they said Chinese spy will notice our address if you send to ours. This is real. And they said, I mean, one big church in Maryland even kind of resending their invitation for me to speak in their mission conference out of the fear of one deacons who came from mainland China and said, oh, my family members are still in China. By inviting Bob Fu as a speaker, they would be jeopardized, in danger. I mean, this kind of a psychological warfare. Of course, they persecuted those who travel back to China. I have seen so many cases already. Those who, the Chinese pastors or Christian believers, when they travel back to China, they immediately receive threat and so-called warning by the state security agencies. Purposely, some were like said, don't talk to that Bao Fu. Don't get close to China Aid. Don't, of course, all these don'ts. These are real threat. And even the physical threat happening in these American communities from San Francisco to Flushing, New York City. I mean, look at during the kind of China's National Day, you have the Chinese flag are being hang around and promoted, and whenever there's a kind of a voice of the disagreement, people were beaten up physically. I mean, in the U.S. soil.
Oh, that's incredible. So one thing that to kind of finish up, this was a very important point I think you raised during the last Committee on Present Danger Roundtable, if I recall. And I think you mentioned this a little bit, that Taiwan is kind of becoming like a case study of effective Chinese influence. Or like when I say effective, I mean kind of dangerously effective.
Yeah.
Can you just tell me a little bit more about what you meant when you were talking about that and how that applies to the rest of the world?
Yeah, I really had been observing Taiwan, 23 million people, one of the really best kind of democracy model, right, in at least the Asia Pacific. Certainly. And for years, and out of my recent trip in Taipei, I found, wow, some cars even have both the China flag and the Communist Party's flag, and with big loudspeaker and broadcasting Communist Party's propaganda on Taipei Street. And I said, wow, this is the most vivid example showing like, you have the Nazi, kind of are doing their propaganda on the street of Rome, on the street of Berlin. I mean, I'm not against the freedom of speech, but it shows, when you turn on TV in Taiwan, you saw, those overwhelmingly pro-China, some with subtlety, some without, and you have the CCTV propaganda were freely kind of transmitted, and you have their newspapers are just broadcasted the Chinese foreign ministry's kind of quotation and propaganda freely.
And these are ostensibly free media, but they're not as so free anymore.
No, not free anymore. So that's a very scared, kind of a scenario to see the Communist parties are taking over the kind of mass media first in Taiwan. So that's why I raised this case, and I feel, as a Chinese, as a Christian, as a pastor, from my faith and from my conscience, we're taught to really to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk, humbly with our God. We need to really speak to the truth, speak the truth as it is, and we couldn't pretend, with political correctness. So that's my reason, to answer your first question is, even as a American, citizen, out of my civil duty, when I joined American citizenship, I pledge to the immigration judge that I will uphold the Constitution of the United States of America, to cherish and protect the freedom of this land. So I will do this both out of my faith and out of my civil duty.
Powerful place to finish up. Bob, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Jan.